Welcome, Dr. Doty.
Thank you. It's great to be with you today.
Really looking forward to talking to you. I think I might be unique in that some people like fangirl over celebrities. I fangirl over scientists, physicians, spiritual leaders, all of those. So I'm really honored to have you here
Oh,
today.
that's really kind of you.
Yeah, really love your work. So I would love for you to just introduce yourself briefly to the audience and tell them a little bit about the trajectory of your career, because we were just talking off mic about how you were a neurosurgeon, technically still are a neurosurgeon, but your career has kind of taken a different path since then.
Sure. Without getting too much into the weeds, as you know, everybody has a backstory. In fact, as you were mentioning before we came on live, you were telling me a little bit about yours. And I grew up in a challenging background. My father was an alcoholic, and my mother had had a stroke when I was a child and was partially paralyzed, had a seizure disorder, became chronically depressed, ended up attempting suicide multiple times. And the challenge, of course, for a child in that situation is in some ways, it's a constant type of trauma. And it's very hard for a child to overcome that type of a background to quote unquote become a success. What changed for me, and I think it's an interesting reality, is how one person can change your life. And I met a woman in a magic shop, but quite by accident. And she um, actually knew nothing about magic. She was the owner's mother. But we began talking, and I really connected with her because she was a very radiant human being who made me feel psychologically safe, which, as you know, is a very important thing for us to be able to open up and be authentic. And we started talking. And long story short, she said to me, I'm here for another 6 weeks. If you show up every day, I think I can teach you something that can help you. And at that point, I was filled with a sense of hopelessness and despair. And what she taught me was a mindfulness practice long before that terminology was used commonly. And she also taught me a manifestation practice. And from all of that, she inspired me and gave me confidence, and in some ways taught me to overcome my limiting beliefs. And that allowed me to truly change the trajectory of my life to become a physician, a neurosurgeon, an entrepreneur, and ultimately, uh, once I became a neurosurgeon and an entrepreneur, nominally I had reached every pinnacle of success defined by society,
Hmm.
which of course promotes this narrative that if you're wealthy, powerful, or have a prominent position, that that will lead to happiness. And here I was in that position having everything, and I was more unhappy than I'd ever been in my life. And what finally got my attention was that I ended up losing about $80 million in the dot-com crash. And I went from this very prominent position, but a very unhappy position, to reflecting on my life. And what I realized was all the actions I was doing were focused on me being acknowledged, or people telling me how great I was. And it was empty. And every time I reached a pinnacle, I kept expecting this outside affirmation to make me feel okay and to deal with my own shame and
Hmm.
insecurities. And of course, it did not. And so when I lost everything, I went through a period of reflection. And what was interesting, and you have to remember, I was 12 years old when this interaction happened. And when I was taught this visualization technique, I was looking through the eyes of a 12-year-old, and I missed a bit. And so, I wrote down on this list she gave me, or she asked me to write this list. I wanted a Rolex, I wanted to be rich, I wanted to live in a mansion, I wanted a Porsche. And certainly I ended up getting all of those things. The thing I missed was that everything was self-focused, and I didn't have the maturity to understand that uh, focusing only on yourself ends up being hollow, and you
Mm-hmm.
end up being unhappy. So when I went through that period of reflection, after losing that money, in fact, I was $3 million in the hole. I always tell people you get two good friends when that happens. One is your banker because I borrowed $15 million and had to pay it back.
Oof.
And the other was my lawyer. Long story short, though, I had made some stock donations to charity. And I met with my lawyer, and he said, look, we actually did not file the paperwork. You can take all of that stock back. But after this period of reflection, I decided to go ahead and donate that stock.
Hmm.
And that ended up being $30 million to charity.
Wow.
But the interesting thing about that was I tell people I went from rags to literally riches to rags. But when I went through this period of reflection and I stopped focusing on me and what I needed,
Mm-hmm.
but looking through the lens of how can I be of service,
Mm-hmm.
I got everything. And that
Mm.
included, as an example, founding the center at Stanford that studies the neuroscience of compassion, but also uh, it turned out, or it ended up, that the Dalai Lama was our first benefactor.
Mm-hmm.
And then he and I became friends, and I became chairman of the Dalai Lama Foundation. And then this led me to leading most of the leading spiritual and religious leaders in the world. And so it was a very fascinating trajectory. But uh, I would say that I got much more in terms of riches from that situation
Mm.
because I let go of what I thought I wanted. And I think in some ways that's the challenge, especially for young people, is understanding the difference between what you think you want
Yes.
and what you actually need.
Yeah. Wow. That's a really powerful story. And there's a lot that I could relate to in my own life, even though circumstances are different. But, I remember back when I was deep into my alcoholism, I kept thinking that something external would change my circumstances and change how I felt inside. And I felt like if I only got the right amount of money or the right car or the right relationship, or I just got back in school, the right job, everything would get better. And I had an experience in my recovery. I would say 5 or 6 years into recovery, I had all the things, all the money, all the cars, all the material stuff, the houses, flying private, and I was miserable because I was putting that ahead of my spiritual life, my inner life. And I think that people can hear that and understand it, but it's completely different when you experience it yourself. And I remember for me, it was really jarring because I thought, well, now what? And I don't know if you had that experience too, where, I thought at least it would move the needle a little bit, as far as happiness goes. And of course, it's nice to be financially secure and all of that. But it was kind of a desperate moment for me because I thought, well, I got this all wrong. And like, I don't know where to go from here.
No, that's exactly right. And it's so sad because popular media has promoted a narrative of what defines success,
Hmm.
especially in a Western capitalist society, and that's money, power, and position.
Hmm.
And the sad thing is that so many young people chase after that
Hmm.
because they don't have the experience or the insight. And now I will tell you, it's interesting because I've talked to some people who go, well, I just want to try having everything
Yeah.
and see how unhappy I'll be.
Yeah. Maybe it'll be different for me.
And don't get me wrong, I have nothing against material success
Hmm.
in the context of also having an inner life of
Hmm.
and spirituality, maybe one being of service to others.
Hmm.
But that really has, I think, to be the focus of your life, not sort of the selfish narrative of what makes me happy, because the most powerful thing any of us have is our ability to have connection with others.
Hmm.
And that makes us a human. When we're able to do that, we connect with others. Our physiology works its best, both mental and peripheral physiology. Our longevity is increased.
Hmm.
And it's all about uh, seeing the other, recognizing that everyone is suffering, and making efforts to try to relieve that.
Hmm. Yeah, and I don't know if this resonates with you at all, but in recovery, again, um, it's kind of this altruistic movement, right? And there's a big emphasis on being of service to others. And for me, it's really the only thing that provides relief because I forget about myself. And you were saying, like, you were so self-focused, and when you make others the priority or the focus, you are forgetting what you are getting, what you aren't getting, what you're afraid of losing, what you, all of those things.
No, that's right. And it's interesting you talk about your own recovery because externally, I mean, for many people, without hearing my story, they think, oh, wow, you had a cushy life and look
Mm-hmm.
at your situation. And
Yeah.
I will tell you, I have struggled with addiction myself,
Mm.
and I still have a spots after
Mm-hmm.
30 some years. So,
Wow. Wow.
yep.
Um, okay. So right now, I feel like manifestation is really popular. It's everywhere. All kinds of people promoting different kinds of manifestations. What do we get wrong about manifestation?
Well, I think in very much it relates to what we were just talking about. As an example, there's the book The Secret, which, as you probably know, was incredibly popular and had
Mm-hmm.
several spin-off aspects of it. But if you really look into it, the narrative was very self-focused.
Mm-hmm.
What do I want? If you want to be a millionaire, if you want to do, have a Porsche, et cetera, whatever it was, you just do this. And in fact, that's what I ended up doing because I was very self-focused and I
Mm-hmm.
did not have self-awareness or insight as a 12-year-old. So I just put all the techniques that are used commonly for manifestation out there. And I did get all those things,
Hmm.
but I was miserable.
Mm-hmm.
And what I realized in this period of self-reflection was that one, that type of narrative where you're self-focused leads to unhappiness. But the other is that the most powerful aspect is in your mind. And you mentioned you kept looking for things in the universe that were going to come and save you.
Mm-hmm.
The first sentence in my book is the universe doesn't give a fuck about you.
It's my favorite thing ever.
And it's funny, I was talking to John Hamm the other day, and he was saying, because he's read the book early on, he was
Mhm.
saying, well, at best it is indifferent, but
Yeah.
uh, but that is the problem, and the power is within you. And this is what people forget because they think that something outside has the power to influence their lives. And it is in some way, but the most powerful thing to change your life is inside of you. It's
Mm.
just learning how to use the tools that already exist because all of us every day are manifesting. It's
Mhm.
just we do it very inefficiently for most people.
Mhm.
So having techniques that maximize your brain, if you will, to embed your intention are very powerful. And
Mhm.
so this book is actually based on neuroscience. It's not based on the woo-woo and the pseudoscience.
Mhm.
And but I would say that there are aspects of it that are identical. It's just like religion. I mean, religion is fundamentally based on compassion.
Mhm.
But over thousands of years, people have learned these techniques, but they've wrapped it always around a dogma that
Mhm.
serves that culture. And in some ways, I think that's analogous to what's happened with manifestation. But there are very concrete ways in which you can maximize the potential for you to manifest. Because one, manifestation isn't a one and done, it takes work.
Mhm.
And the other thing is that when you focus on the other in the process of manifesting, several things happen. One is you get outside of yourself and you
Mhm.
realize you're not that important.
Mhm.
Two is when you're of service to others, that activates your brain networks much more than if it's self-focused.
Hmm.
It's like depression is self-focused, right? Right?
Mhm.
When you're afraid, it's very self-focused.
Yes.
When you accept that things aren't always perfect, when you are not chasing things for self, but are focused on making other people happy, making their lives better, you realize several things happen. You do get all the things you want, but oftentimes you realize that the things you thought you wanted aren't really what you need.
Yeah.
And that's a fascinating journey, I think.
I have lots of experience with that one, and I've come to the conclusion that I am not a good judge of what's good for me. or bad for me, because so many things, like you, things that I thought I wanted, I got, and they turned out to be the worst thing for me. And conversely, things that I thought would be the worst things for me were the best things for me. I always refer to getting sober 10 years ago. I thought getting sober would be the end of my life, the worst thing to ever happen to me. And it's the foundation for my entire life. And it's been the greatest joy of my life.
And again, you went from being self-focused
Hmm.
by drinking and sort of
Yeah.
doing these negative behaviors, if you will, and then suddenly you're helping other people
Hmm.
overcome their own struggles, or looking at people who are suffering, and also understanding, I think, that everyone is suffering in
Yeah.
different ways.
Hmm.
And this is, I think, also where people get confused, is because if you look at the media and some influencers, they give the impression that their lives are perfect.
Hmm.
And, having been around the block several times
Hmm.
and knowing some extraordinarily wealthy people, oftentimes it's just the opposite. I mean,
Yeah.
so many of these people are miserable, and they keep trying to fill the emptiness that all of us have with things.
Yes.
And the thing is that it's the difference between what we call hedonic happiness and
Hmm.
eudaimonic happiness. A hedonic happiness is all focused on self-pleasure
Hmm.
and decreasing pain, but it's very transitory. So
Yes.
you have to keep doing more and more of it.
Yep.
And also it builds on people admiring you for, living this lifestyle. And, but, suddenly nobody's that interested again, and you start feeling this emptiness.
Hmm.
When you're of service to people, when you care about people, the reward is this incredible effect on your physiology, both mental and peripheral physiology. Because if you look at how we evolved as a species, we're one of the few animals that our offspring don't run off into the jungle or the forest or swim away. They have to be cared for.
Hmm.
Well, there's an imperative there for our survival that we take care of them. Well, why would we spend time and resources to take care of our offspring unless somehow we're rewarded?
Mm.
And the way we're
Wow.
rewarded is by the release of different neurotransmitters, one of which I'm sure you're aware of is oxytocin,
Hmm.
or
Love
the
it.
love hormone, or bonding hormone. And that stimulates your pleasure and reward center. So you want to do these actions for others. The
Hmm.
other thing is that it also shifts you into engagement of your parasympathetic nervous system. And this is called the rest and digest system. So this is the system where, when you're in that state, you're open, you
Mm.
connect with others, your executive control areas in your brain work their best. It gives you access to memory, prior experiences, but it also has a huge effect on your peripheral physiology in the context of what we call heart rate variability. It
Hmm.
decreases that, and that may seem like a paradox, but also your heart rate goes down, your blood pressure decreases, your immune system's boosted, the release of stress hormones are decreased,
Hmm.
inflammatory protein production is markedly decreased, and actually all from just being kind, thoughtful, and connecting with others.
Hmm.
And it's very, very powerful. And that's really, if somebody experiences that authentically, they get it suddenly, and
Hmm.
they start focusing on that, because when you're in that state, you're constantly happy because
Hmm.
you're being rewarded for caring.
Hmm. Yeah, and I've heard you say that conversely, if you are in fear or anxiety, it's kind of blocking that executive functioning. It's blocking that access to memory and experience. So I would imagine that you just get, kind of in this little bubble.
No, you're exactly right, and that's the sad thing is, and in some ways, this is what happens when you're self-focused,
Yeah.
because when you're self-focused, you're worried about you, which in some ways a fear state.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, the fear state activates your sympathetic nervous system, this
Hmm.
flight, fight, or freeze response.
Hmm.
And it does just the opposite in terms of how it affects your brain and your peripheral physiology. And so, in some ways, what we're talking about is understanding the difference between functioning in a fear state and a love state.
Hmm.
And I would suggest you, and the neuroscience supports it, when you look through the lens of love, uh, your ability to manifest is much, much greater.
Hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about some of the science behind manifestation. I know that you talk about things like repetition and feeling the emotion. So, how does that come into play when we're manifesting? Because I'm sure everybody listening is going, this sounds great. How do I manifest the things that I want? Focusing on others rather than myself. Like, how does that look in practice?
Well, let me give a brief overview of various brain networks, and I don't want to get lost in the
We
weeds.
love the science here. Go into the weeds. We love it.
Okay. So, uh, what many people don't appreciate is we have these cognitive brain networks,
Hmm.
and they're a combination of different areas in the brain that work together in very specific situations. So, they're basically four that impact your ability to manifest. So the first is your default mode network. Okay. And this is when you mind wander, but it's also self referential and it creates a narrative of yourself. And conversely, the executive control network is diminished when you're mind wandering and it's activated when you're not. And they work in combination, obviously, then. And the executive control network, though, is how it makes things happen. As an example, how does it manifest your intention?
Mm.
But the other two networks that are important are the salience network and the attention network. And the way they work is that when you are able to embed your intention uh, into your subconscious, and that's the part of our brain where we have some access to versus the unconscious. Um, then when that is activated, it's interesting because it acts like a bloodhound in some ways, where it's looking for situations that can help you manifest your intention.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that, as an example, is that um, I was at a coffee shop recently, and there's a project I'm working on, and and I'm sure you've been in the situation, like if you're at a party, even though it's loud and noisy, and you hear your name, you immediately turn, even though there's tons
Mm.
of noise there.
Hmm.
And in a similar sense, it determines what is salient, right? And so I was at a coffee shop, and there's this project I'm working on, and like even though it's noisy, they're a couple tables over, I hear two individuals talking about the exact same thing that had been working on. And I went over and introduced myself, and I started talking, and now we're working together on the project. And the point
Wow.
is that it was looking for opportunities. Now, some people might call that synchronicity
Hmm.
or a coincidence, but it's not. It is you've embedded this, and so what's happened is it gets embedded, and then the salience network is looking for these different opportunities, but it activates the attention network to laser focus, defining what that is you want to accomplish. And then once that happens, it also activates your executive control network to actually make that happen in the sense of on a conscious level, making that happen and
Wow.
doing. And so when you're relaxed, when you're comfortable, when you're open, all of these networks work their best. When it's more self focused, it's not to say they don't work, but what your goal is, or most of our goal is, how do I manifest what's important to me?
Hmm.
But again, as you mentioned earlier, you have to clarify
Yes.
your intentions and understand the difference between what you think you need versus
Hmm.
what you truly need. And
Hmm.
those can be far apart, and it can be very hard. The interesting thing is that once you're able to do that, though, and practice these different techniques. And you mentioned some of them. And one of the greatest things, I think, and I mentioned earlier myself, was a meditation practice. Because in that way, you get access to these deeper levels,
Hmm.
and you can actually also learn to focus. Because without attention and focus, it's hard to accomplish anything.
Hmm.
And I will tell you, as a 12-year-old in that magic shop, and I would go with this woman for a couple hours in this dingy room at the back with shag carpeting to sit with her and do these practices. Uh, uh, um, you can't learn anything, or you can't escape sort of this voice inside your head unless you learn how to do that. And the
Mm.
best way to do that is a mindfulness practice.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I did learn is, though, that, and I'm sure you're familiar with John Kabat-Zinn.
Mm-hmm.
John's a friend of mine, but you look at the mindfulness practice, I viewed it slightly differently in the sense that it doesn't explicitly talk about compassion and self-compassion. And these are really two critical components of overcoming the negative self-talk that limits your beliefs.
Mm-hmm. I feel like you're anticipating some of my questions because I was going to follow up by asking, what kind of mindfulness practice do you have, and what do you recommend other people do, or does it just vary, whatever people can do to kind of go within?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges for many people is they have a vision of meditation as sitting on a mat
Mm-hmm.
and in this pose that's uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And especially for type A people, it's hard to handle being quiet and silencing yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and that's certainly a way to do it. But if you look at the work of Thich Nhat Hanh and
Mm-hmm.
others, there's walking meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, very powerful. The purpose is to be with yourself, to not be distracted, to not respond in the sense to the negative dialogue or get distracted by it. The other component, though, I think is very important, which is my own practice and actually what we teach at the center I founded at Stanford, is to change the narrative, not just to ignore the negative self-talk, but actually change it with positive self-affirmations.
Mm.
Because when you're always beating yourself up, again, it's hard. That limits your beliefs. When you
Mm-hmm.
say, I can't do it, by
Mm-hmm.
definition, that becomes your reality. And honestly, the brain does not know the difference between what you're thinking and what is.
Mm.
And so once you do that, you've already lost in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I do emphasize, though, that none of us can get rid of the negative dialogue 100%. It's just not
Mm-hmm.
possible. It's not
Yeah.
how we are wired or how we evolved. But you can certainly diminish it. You can certainly learn to ignore most of it. And that will, in some ways, liberate you
Yes.
to be your best self, to thrive.
Mm-hmm. I started doing TM 5 or 6 years ago. I was dabbling in other kinds of meditation prior to that, and just I wasn't feeling really like I was getting anywhere. And suddenly, I don't know if I manifested this, but I started noticing people everywhere who I really admired who were doing TM. There was this couple who they've been sober each 50 plus years. They're in their 90s. And I went to dinner with them, and they were so youthful and just had this thing about them that you can't place. And I asked the wife what her secret was, and she said TM. And then there was somebody else who, I asked, what are you doing? And she said TM. And so I decided to try it for myself. And the idea of sitting in silence for 20 minutes twice a day was so daunting to me.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that blocks a lot of people because, we are so resistant and probably on some level afraid of being with ourselves, even for 5 minutes. And we're so distracted now, we can go through the day without having to be with ourselves at all. So what do you recommend people do if they're feeling like that?
Well, again, as you pointed out for yourself, you tried different techniques. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
really, the technique is try to silence the chatter
Mm-hmm.
and to just be with yourself. And also understand that every human being is imperfect, incomplete, and life is impermanent.
Mm-hmm.
And these fundamental tenets, that is reality. And so you can't beat yourself up. And the reality is, every one of us, no matter what we've done on some level, if we authentically want to be better people, you understand that all of us are imperfect, but every one of us, no matter what we've done, still deserve to be loved and cared for.
Mm-hmm.
I gave a talk at Princeton recently about youth mental health. And, I stood in front of this audience of obviously academics and very prominent people. And I said, I stand before you as an imperfect, flawed human being who's repeatedly made mistakes, who's lied, has done horrible things that I'm ashamed of, but I still deserve to be loved.
Mm-hmm.
But to be able to get to that point,
Yeah.
it takes a lot of work, but it is possible. And through some of the techniques in my book and also my prior book, Into the Magic Shop,
Mm-hmm.
there's a whole lot of information that in some ways, not only does it tell my own story, but the reason it tells my story is because so many people resonate with those experiences,
Hmm.
and the techniques that I learned have been beneficial to many, many people. And in some ways, it really warms my heart that I've been able to sort of be the channel. And in some ways, it is what Ruth taught me, which was fundamentally to pay it forward.
Mm. Is Ruth still alive?
Well, she'd be about 120.
Oh, I didn't do the fast math on that
Yeah.
one.
But yes, she is.
But did she get to see you?
No, no, it's actually quite sad. So I spent this summer with her, which was obviously transformative in many ways. And then she left. About 9 months later, I went back to the strip mall where this magic shop was, and all the stores were closed, and it was surrounded by a fence.
Hmm.
And they were tearing it down, it looked like. And it was interesting because, as I talk about in my book, I had this orange Stingray bike with this banana seat, and I'm sure that's long before your time. But I remember it was dusk and the wind was sort of blowing. This was in the high desert. And so you see these streaky white clouds, and dusk is happening, and the wind is sort of blowing. I'm looking at this and I go, my God, what happened here? And then this tumbleweed comes and hits me. And it was this very evocative scene.
Mm.
But when I wrote that first book, I actually hired an investigator
Hmm.
because I wanted to separate what I thought happened from the facts, or at
Hmm.
least as best I could, because all of us create a narrative in our head about things, right? And it turned out that a few years later, she got breast cancer and died of breast cancer,
Mm.
and which was very sad because obviously down the road, I would have loved to have come back and say thank you.
Hmm.
The interesting thing is, though, that after that book came out, an individual reached out to me, and he said my parents were best friends with her,
Wow.
and he said, "Could we meet?" And I said, "Sure." And so we met, and he gave me a book that she had signed to his parents
Hmm.
with her name and signature,
Wow.
and also a necklace that she'd given his mother. So,
Oh my gosh.
yeah.
That's incredible. You were saying earlier that it's okay to strive for things, I think, or want certain things. And it reminded me of something that I heard somebody say again in recovery. It's where all my good things come from. And she was talking about the same thing. And she said, some people just want the 1-story building, but some people want the 50-story building. And it's okay to want that. But the higher you want to go, the deeper your foundation has to be. And what you were saying kind of reminded me of that. But I've also heard you talking about, the fact that it's okay to feel like I have enough. And ultimately, we're the only ones who are going to make ourselves happy. So can you talk about the moment that you kind of realized that for yourself, and maybe how other people can try to get to that place as well?
Well, I think that's one of the biggest challenges in our society
Hmm.
because, again, not to beat up Western capitalism too much,
Hmm.
because it's allowed us to be here today and all sorts of wonderful things to happen, but it also has a negative side. And one of those is a constant uh, narrative that you need more.
Hmm.
And I think this is one of the biggest challenges for people. And you mentioned goals or attachment to outcomes, if you will. The problem is that goals and achieving are wonderful things, but you have to keep it in the context of not being so singularly focused on accomplishing that. Because when that is the only thing of interest to you, two things happen. One is the journey there is actually where most wonderful things happen. That's where you interact with people. That's where you authentically connect with people.
Mm.
And it's that authentic connection, again, that stimulates our parasympathetic nervous system, actually results in our physiology working its best, our longevity to be increased. And when you're singularly focused on that, everything else drops aside: relationships, friendships, important things that you should be paying attention to. And then you get there. And for many people, they get there again, as we were talking about. I'm at the top of the mountain, so what?
Hmm.
And if there's nobody who deeply loves you or connects with you, what was the whole purpose of it anyway?
Mhm.
Again, I'm not against material things, but it's when that becomes your singular focus and you forget about the reality that those mean nothing,
Mhm.
the most important thing. And you can look at the Blue Zone studies. You can look at the work by Robert Waldinger, who is the head of the Harvard Longevity Study. You can look at the work of Robert Waldinger at Harvard and the longevity study. And every bit of science tells you that when you're not self-focused, when you're focusing on relationships, deep connections, that has an incredible positive impact on your health, your well-being, and your longevity.
Mm.
And that attitude, looking through the world through that lens, is actually how you are able to most likely manifest every goal or dream that you have.
Mhm.
And part of it is a meditative practice, but doesn't have to be, as we were talking about, sitting on a mat or. But there are a variety of techniques. You mentioned TM,
Mhm.
Bob Roth. I don't know if you know Bob. He's a good friend of
Not
mine.
personally. I would love to though.
Oh, he's a special being. But we can go into spirituality if you
Yeah.
want. But because I was just thinking for some reason, do you know Amma, the hugging saint?
No.
Oh, you should check out AMMA. She's
Uh-huh.
an incredible. She's a woman from India. She doesn't speak English. She's about like 5 feet tall, and
Mhm.
but she's just a light that's so amazing. And she's
Mm.
like the Dalai Lama. When you're with her, uh, you have this sense of unconditional love and acceptance.
Hmm.
And you see, this is what we're all striving for.
Yeah.
And that's why so many people follow these people, because when you're in their presence, and this can be you, you can be that gift to the
Mhm.
world. And when you're that presence, then everything is possible. You don't have limiting beliefs anymore.
Mhm.
You see the world through a lens of abundance, not through scarcity. And it's fear that creates the scarcity narrative. So this is possible, but it's all in your head. You are the only person who can release yourself from the prison.
Mhm.
And that's by self acceptance, self love, and caring for others.
Mhm. So powerful. Tell everybody where they can get your book and find out more about your work.
Sure. So I hope I don't bore people too much, but there are a few sites. One is you can get the book at any bookseller pretty much for pre-order. It's called Mind Magic: The Neuroscience of Manifestation and How It Changes Everything. You can also get the other book, my first book, which is called Into the Magic Shop: A Neurosurgeon's Quest to Discover the Mysteries of the Brain and the Secrets of the Heart. The center that I run at Stanford is called the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. And actually, we provide a variety of courses on compassion, self compassion, and how to help you with stress and anxiety.
Mhm.
And that site is ccare.stanford.edu. There's also my website, which is James R. Doty, MD, and it gives you all that information there. Plus, shockingly, I also have a podcast,
Mhm.
intothemagicshop.com. And the other interesting thing, which I actually haven't mentioned, but which you might be interested in, is I actually created an app, believe it or not, for mental
Oh.
wellness called Happy, HAPPI AI. But the interesting thing about it is it assesses your emotional state
Hmm.
through facial expression and voice analysis,
Wow.
as well as converting your speech into text to understand the context. Then it's connected to a conversational AI knowledge base we created based on compassion focused therapy and psychology. But the key is it's connected to a human avatar
Wow.
and it talks to you. And the wonderful thing about that is that um, so many people are afraid of being judged
Mhm.
that here you can have a conversation and be open and honest. And it is, if you will, programmed to be thoughtful, to listen, to care. And the fascinating thing about it is, have you ever tried VR glasses?
Mhm.
Yeah, well, typically they'll put you over an abyss, right?
Yeah.
And you're on a plank,
Yeah.
and they'll usually tell you to jump off.
Uh-huh.
Well, eh, most people won't, right? because even though on a cognitive level, you know you're safe in a carpeted room,
Mm-hmm.
on your subconscious, you cannot do it.
Yeah.
The thing about using an avatar is you cannot help but connect to it as a human being.
Wow.
So you get that emotional connection and feeling of support, which is far different than chatbots
Yeah.
where you type in like, I'm sad. Well, are you sad like you stubbed your toe sad? Are you
Right.
sad like, potentially going to commit suicide? So
Mm-hmm.
it understands emotion, but it also gives you this depth of connection because you cannot connect typing into the universe, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
I've tried testing conversations with ChatGPT and it didn't get very far for certain things.
well, it's funny you say that because I was on ChatGPT and I said, write a bio for me, right?
Uh-huh.
And it was actually fairly accurate, but it listed like 10 awards that I had received,
Mm-hmm.
and 5 of them were just completely made up.
No way.
Yes, but I still put them on my CV.
I mean, if ChatGPT
If they
says,
said it,
yeah.
it's real.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your work. This was such an honor.
Well, thank you for having me. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. It was a joy talking to you.
Thank you.